All right, good morning, everyone. I am going to go ahead and jump in and get this panel started. My name is Christina McLaughlin. I am the Partnership Coordinator for the Urban and Community Forestry Program based out of Albany. I'm also today's event host, so you'll see me popping in and out throughout the day. I want to welcome you all to our second session of today's conference. We're really excited to have Carl here from our Bureau of Wildlife here at DEC, and he's going to be talking about bats and birds in the urban forest. So welcome everyone again. Welcome, Carl. Thank you so much for presenting today, and you can take it away.
Okay, thanks a lot, Christina. This talk is going to concentrate a lot on protected species, although I would say the conservation measures that we're going to discuss eventually mostly apply to the same for protected and unprotected species. So it's going to start with a overview of the relevant laws and regulations. Not the most exciting portion of the talk, but I think it's essential to get a good understanding going forward on that. And then it's going to move into some specifics about the individual animals themselves. So the first thing is, why is this talk even necessary? And well, one thing that I've certainly noticed is there are lots of concerns among forest managers about bat protection and the implications that has on forest management. Much of this concern, I would have to say, is really unwarranted to a large degree, at least currently, and hopefully I can clarify that somewhat. Although I'm also going to talk about some potential federal changes that are in the works as far as protected species and that have some implications going forward. Somewhat related to that, or at least along those same lines, there's been recently some publicized changes to the way the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is implementing the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which is another a major federal bird protection law that's potentially relevant. And I'm also going to discuss some concerns in the conservation practices that turns out are actually rather similar for both birds and bats. So there is this unavoidable discussion, I think, of the laws and regulations, and an understanding is really helpful. Understanding of the regulations, the terminology, the associated practices go a long way towards minimizing the angst that I was alluding to earlier. It's certainly a potentially confusing situation, and frankly, I'm not going to be able to resolve all of that confusion in this talk. It's just not enough time. But hopefully we'll make some progress in that direction anyway. So I'm going to start with the Endangered Species Act. This is the highest level of protection that's afforded by law to wildlife. Includes two different categories of protection, the threatened and endangered status. Although the difference between the two is mostly technical, the protections for threatened and endangered species are usually pretty much the same. And there are both New York State and federal laws that are described as the Endangered Species Act. They're very similar to each other, at least in the way the law is written. However, the implementation is somewhat different. And I'm just going to say now that I can't really speak for the Fish and Wildlife Service today. I'm going to talk mostly about the state law and regulations, and I'll mention a few things related to the federal point of view. However, on one thing, probably the biggest useful difference to know between the state and federal level protections is that there are a number of species that are listed at the state level that are not listed at the federal level. So I'm going to go into some definitions related to the endangered species protection. And the first one is kind of an archaic term. It's referred to as take. It's written in the law, so it keeps getting used that way, even though it's not normally used that in that same context in colloquial conversation. But it refers to pursuing, shooting, hunting, killing animals, which is mostly not relevant to this group. But it's important to know that endangered species protection also includes against lesser acts like disturbing, harrying, or worrying the animals. And most notably, probably, is that it includes the definition of take includes the adverse modification of occupied habitat, which is to say modification of habitat that causes some harm to the animals, even if they're not actually present at the time that the action takes place. And in that sentence that I just used, I started another term, the phrase occupied habitat, which is in itself a source of some confusion. In New York, as a rule, we generally only protect occupied habitat, that is to say, the habitat where the animals are actually living. And just because a bird or a bat flies over a piece of property, that doesn't make it occupied. The regulatory definition of occupied habitat suggests that the use of the habitat by the animal has to be associated with some documented essential behavior. And so there's two important points there. The documented aspect means, we're only acting on properties where the species has been demonstrated to currently exist. And the essential behaviors refers to activities like nesting or breeding or hibernating or feeding or something along those lines that has a significant biological relationship for the animal. And then from here, we're going to go on. We're going to be limiting the discussion really to what's known as incidental take. So incidental take is take that occurs unintentionally while in the pursuit of some other lawful activity. So we're not talking about those hunting and killing kinds of things. These are unintentional activities. Most relevant to the discussion of, in this group anyway. Even with endangered species protection, it's important to remember that it's not absolute. The preferred approach is always to avoid anything that could be defined as a take, but sometimes take can't be avoided and still have us be able to get our jobs done. And so recognizing that the state and the feds also have the ability to issue permits to allow a certain amount of incidental take. These permits are rare, and not because they're hard to get so much, but because we almost always can figure out ways to avoid take altogether. And so to give you a illustrative example, I saw some data from a relatively recent year where some 700 projects came to our attention for review for possible impacts to listed species. And out of those 700 projects, only a single permit was issued. And so what that means is in 99.8% of the cases, we were able to figure out ways for the take to be avoided, and in most cases for the projects to go forward. So avoidance is always the goal, and it's usually possible. So another major statute that we want to talk about for for this group especially is the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And so this is one of the more far-reaching wildlife protective laws that's currently on the books. It's also one of the oldest. It was initiated more than 100 years ago. Despite the name, the act protects virtually all native birds, really, even those that are not commonly thought of as migratory. And you might wonder, why such a broadly written law was ever really deemed necessary. Well, I think, frankly, it's safe to say that, a law like this probably would not be written today, but 100 years ago was a very different time. Many people know, for example, that unregulated hunting played a big role in the wildlife community, and the poster child example of this is the passenger pigeon, literally driven to extinction largely by unregulated hunting. Formerly a very common bird. What most people don't realize probably as well is that there were many other birds that were heavily hunted at the time as well. In the 19th century, it was common to have birds not thought of as game animals on the menu, literally. Things like blackbirds and robins, for example, you might actually see them on a restaurant menu. And unregulated hunting at the time depleted most of these animals in the eastern forests. And in addition to harvesting for food, many millions of birds were killed to supply what now seems like a crazy obsession with feathers used to adorn the hats of both men and women. And yeah, this is a legit fashion photo from the day. And yes, that is a stuffed crow, I believe. That's part of this hat design. So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is very clear that direct intentional take, like hunting, is clearly prohibited in most cases for most of these species, unless they're designated as game species. The act itself is not nearly as clear when it comes to incidental take. And historically, the enforcement of incidental take under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act has been, I guess it's fair to call it, inconsistent. Changed a lot from one political administration to another. And one of the last acts of the most recent previous federal administration, this was, I think, promulgated in January of this year, was to implement a rule that clearly stated that there is essentially no incidental take protection for birds under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So that was at least a very clear statement. This change, however, proved immediately to be very unpopular with the public. And the current federal administration has announced their intent to revoke that new rule and to restore some degree of incidental take protection for the birds that are covered under this act. So passage of that change seems very likely, although it's really not totally clear what that's going to look like going forward. Probably the best clue that we have is part of this quote from the public announcement declaring the intent to return to implementing the Migratory Bird Treaty Act as a prohibiting incidental take and applying enforcement discretion consistent with judicial precedent. And that sounds, a lot more straightforward than it probably really is. The judicial precedent is rather spotty. So I think the best advice that we can give at this point is to take as many steps as possible to avoid take of these species and just avoid the whole problem altogether. And I'll talk a little bit about later what that might look like. So jumping into the species-oriented portion of the talk, we're going to start with the Indiana bat. This is one of the original endangered species when the federal law first went into effect over around 50 years ago. The species has been considered endangered ever since. Was doing really well, actually, up until about 2007, when there was talk of actually being able to delist the species, but unfortunately, those hopeful thoughts were turned quickly away when the disease white nose syndrome arrived. And since then, in New York, we've lost about 75% of the Indiana bats that we had. And that's actually much better than any other state in the Northeast. Most of the declines are more severe than that. So the idea that the species could be delisted anytime soon is pretty much gone for the foreseeable future. These bats typically, or actually almost exclusively, roost in trees in the summertime. And there's a couple of examples here of what you might look for in terms of a potential roost tree for Indiana bats. Most of them have exfoliating bark for some reason or other. And then the other roosting structure that they look for are crevices in the, split crevices in a trunk of a stem that's still standing after the bark has fallen off, generally speaking. So we found a bunch of these roost trees in our studies over the years, and 2/3 of them were identified as either dead or dying. And of the ones that, the remaining third or so, most of them were actually large shagbark hickories or the other relatively healthy tree that this species might typically use is large black locust trees. So here's a map showing where the species is found in New York. So you can see the distribution is quite limited. And I should mention here, I guess, that to find out if you have concerns about whether there are any protected species in the area where you're considering doing some work, you have a couple of different choices. The first one, there's an online tool on our what called the Environmental Resource Mapper on the DEC website that you can use to tell it what species might be nearby. And then the other more traditional approach, a little more thorough, is to make a data request for the New York Natural Heritage Program. Here's a picture of some kind of large locust trees that some of which had bats living in at the time, and you might notice the mowed grass down at the base of these trees. These trees are actually literally in the backyard of a residence, suggesting that this species is not incompatible with people. Although, it's really also not an urban animal. I would describe them as favoring, lightly developed areas. So we found them as in places which had about, say, 35 to 65% tree canopy cover over a distance of about 2.5 miles radius from the roost tree. So that's a meaningful distance for this animal in terms of how much it travels. So typically not the kind of thing you're going to find in an urban situation. They also have an aversion to light levels at night, which also tends to put them more in the outskirts rather than what you'd call an urban situation. The other listed species that we have currently now is the northern long-eared bat. This species is currently listed as threatened, although it's under consideration now by the feds to raise that to endangered status. We've lost literally something like 99% of this formerly common animal here in New York, and that's that kind of decline is common, proven to be common throughout the range. unlike the Indiana bat, as I said, this was a common species, but it was also extremely widespread. You could find them prior to the disease in every county outside of New York City and in most towns. We had, you could probably find it in almost any town, really. These are just the ones that we had records for. They are certainly not common anymore, but they are still very widespread. And I'll mention that because of this, the losses have been so severe, we don't consider the entire state to be occupied habitat any longer, even though it pretty much used to be true. We're literally only using records that we have from the species after the major decline took place. Nonetheless, though, there's a potential for encountering northern long-eared bats in pretty much any area that could be described as forested. They're more tolerant of development than Indiana bats, but still generally not really an urban animal. Although there's no actual definition of of what level of urbanness that they'll tolerate. One key difference: the roost trees are pretty similar to what Indiana bats use, but unlike the Indiana bats, northern bats will also use cavities, which allows for a lot smaller tree to be a potential roost tree, down as small as about 3 inches dBH. For a long time, the bat portion of this presentation would end here, but I'm going to talk now about another species that we're on the cusp of adding to the endangered species list, and so that's the little brown bat. This used to be the most common bat in New York before the arrival of the disease, and the losses have been pretty severe, as similar to the other ones I've just been describing. And they're currently under consideration for federal protection, which seems likely, frankly, given the data within the next few years. This species is even more widespread than the northerns, if you can believe that. And while their foraging habitat is still mainly forest oriented, this is a species that is much more tolerant of development and can be found in truly urban areas. I remember back to one of my earliest bat-related experience with DEC. I was doing actually a bat survey in Central Park of New York City, and found a thriving community of little brown bats there at the time. So a strong tolerance for putting up with people is undoubtedly going to make management of this species a challenge once it gets listed. And what the protective rules might look like really is, it's just too early to say. It's really anybody's guess. Just my advice is to stay tuned and see what happens in the next, say, couple of years. Probably things will be clarified. Strategies for avoiding harm to bats. All three of these protected species that I was describing are hibernating bats. So they disappear from the above ground landscape and hibernate in caves and mines in the winter. And so the November through March timeframe is generally, in most places, 100% safe for avoiding any direct take that might happen due to forest management activities in most places. And this is the tool that we rely on the most for avoiding harm to these bats in areas where they're currently known to exist. When you can't avoid the time of year for this bat, these bats, then sometimes there are useful surveys that we can do to rule out their presence on a local scale. Although these are really useful mostly in kind of marginal areas or on very small geographic scale. I should mention the federal approach to protection of northern long-eared bats has been far more lenient than we've been following at the state level. The most forms of incidental take of northern long-eared bats do not currently require a federal incidental take permit. That's likely to change somewhat if, as expected, the species gets upgraded to endangered status, although it's not exactly clear what that's going to mean either. But the Fish and Wildlife Service is under the order of a federal judge to figure all of this out by the fall of 2022, and so should be getting some clarity on that point in the not too distant future. Talking about forest birds, there are some listed birds that could be affected by forestry practice, but none of them really regularly occur in kind of urban settings. So mostly what we're going to talk about, are those migratory concerns, the migratory birds that are covered under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And in common practice, you can generally avoid most of the issues here by focusing around the nesting season. So the standard advice, to the maximum practical extent, approaches that would avoid the take of these birds in an urban setting typically means altering the season of activities to minimize disturbance during the breeding season. So in most places in New York, and for most species, this is the May through August kind of timeframe. Also, if it's suitably safe for the particular land use that we're talking about, snag retention can be really helpful, especially where snags are underrepresented, recognizing, of course, that that's not always possible in the settings that you folks are considering, but whenever it's possible, it's worth thinking about. Getting into specific details more than this is difficult because there are so many species that are under consideration here. I'm going to point you towards a really useful resource. So this book is now, I think it was published in 2008. The second atlas of breeding birds in New York. It's a super useful reference. And it's still available from sellers like Amazon and others, and at a really bargain price these days because it's soon to be replaced. We're working now on the third Atlas of Breeding Birds in New York, but this is a super helpful guide for species-specific information about where you can find species in the state, and also the time of year when certain activities like nesting might be of concern. And so I'll point you there as a generic resource if you're looking for more specific information on a local level or for certain species. That's really what I have for now. If it's still available, I'd be happy to try to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Carl. We have a lot of questions rolling in and a little bit of time. Okay. So let's get to it. Let's see. Would you be able to expand the conversation on the Migratory Bird Act and how it may apply to the proposed wind turbines to be constructed on the south shore of Long Island?
Yeah, that's a good question. This is exactly the sort of thing that the previous federal administration was trying to avoid, and there has been some concerns about take of migratory birds with wind turbines. I have to say, though, specifically about the offshore question, there really isn't a tremendous amount that's actually known about the risk level that those turbines pose. There've been some studies that have gone underway, and I'm certainly not an expert on them. It's certainly possible that some degree of take might occur. I think it's actually likely that some degree would probably occur, but it's going to be difficult to know what and when that happened. I mean, the typical scenario with the terrestrial-based turbines is we have the wind turbine companies generally do post-construction mortality studies to see what's being killed, and that's basically not going to be possible for the offshore turbines. So this is kind of a largely unknown situation at this point, frankly. And I recognize that's probably not a satisfactory question. I will say that most of the jurisdiction for that falls outside of our department. So some small defense I can offer on my own part.
All right, we have about 5 minutes. Can you give some examples on how people might improve and protect the presence of birds and bats in an urban setting?
Yeah, so when it comes to bats, generally speaking, there's two things to focus on. One of them is the roosting structures that I was talking about. And then the other is abundance of insect biomass. So all of New York bats live exclusively on insects, and that's almost exclusively on flying insects. And of course, this is only insect species at night. Unfortunately, these bats don't help us with gypsy moths. So those two things in combination with relatively low light levels, all three of the listed bats that I was talking about have a pretty significant aversion to light levels at night for the most part. So if you had all three of those factors in one place, in a somewhat forested situation, you're almost certainly going to have bats. Artificial roosts are a possibility that might be appropriate in situations. There's a number of different types that are available, and I'll mention also that there is at least one species of bat that's still quite abundant in New York that is common in urban areas. So that's a big brown bat, literally the only species of bat that we have in New York for which we don't have any conservation concern. They're doing so well. So anyway, and most of those roost actually in buildings, believe it or not. So that combination of roosting structures that are appropriate for the species, insect biomass, flying insects at night, and generally, as I said, relatively low light levels are the three things that would make up a successful place where bats might do well.
Great. We'll see if we can squeeze one more in. Anybody who doesn't get their questions answered, you can always send Carl a message on Whova or post on the community board. And maybe Carl can chime in there, other people if they have answers. Do you think birds and bats don't exist as much in urban forests because they're not properly managed for? Do you think their numbers could be increased if they were to be specifically managed for?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely true. Although I would say that, some of the things the activities that you might need to do to promote certain species might be antithetical to the other management goals that you're trying to maintain in an urban forest environment. The snags, for example, that I was describing earlier, it's just not appropriate to have them everywhere. It's a complicated question, though, because each species has its own little niche. I mean, that's why they exist, and so they're all looking for somewhat different things. I made some generalizations about bats, but the truth is, all three of those species that I mentioned, each has its own little separate description of their ideal habitat, and generally it refers to how much vegetative clutter that they're looking for. And then of course with birds, there's all manner, literally a couple of hundred species that could potentially we could be talking about, and every single one of them is somewhat different. So it's pretty challenging. The best thing to do is to take the resources that are available about what species might be found in a given area, the bird atlas being probably the best one from the bird's perspective, and then focusing on the limited number of species that especially do well, I would suggest, in urban or semi-urban areas, that and then going from there on a species by species basis.
Great. Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much. And for everybody, we have a 10-minute break.